Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Human MOOC session. This week, we're talking with Dr. Peter Shea about cognitive presence. And Peter is the Associate Provost for Online Learning, and then he's also a faculty member in the Department of Educational Theory and Practice, where I also got my PhD and was lucky to have him as one of my professors. So thanks a lot for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you now, Peter.
Okay. Thanks, Patrice. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to folks. I think the topic that we have today will be of interest. A little bit more about me. I've been doing research on online teaching and learning for probably 2 decades or more within the SUNY system. Before joining the faculty in the Department of Educational Theory and Practice and in the College of Information, I was the director of online learning for the State University of New York. So we had a pretty big pool of students and faculty with whom we could try to collect data and improve our understanding of online teaching and learning. So for approximately the last 20 years, I've been involved in one way or another in trying to systematically investigate issues of online teaching and learning. So some of the stuff I'm going to share today provides a snapshot of some of the work we've done, especially as it relates to cognitive presence in the community of inquiry model. Let me just pull up this presentation and give folks a chance to see what we're doing. Actually, that's the wrong one. You go back here and try to see if I can find it. Hold on one sec. Yeah. I don't know why I have so many windows of view, Patrice, but I don't seem to be able to pull up my instance of the presentation. Hold on one sec. I'm going to close some other windows and hopefully we'll get that in there. This might just take another minute or two. Hold on, people. Sorry about that. Huh. All I'm seeing is images with our current window. I'm not sure. Can you pull it up on your machine?
Yeah.
Is that working for you?
Let's see. Just open it up.
Is this working now?
Yep. Do you see it?
Okay, let me see. Do you see mine? If you stop screen sharing, I think mine might come on now.
Oh, okay. Yep.
You are seeing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
So I guess to talk a little bit behind what we're talking about when we look at the community of inquiry model, I'd look at a paper that was written by Anna Sfard and appeared in Educational Researcher quite a while ago, and it talks about 2 large metaphors for thinking about what learning is. Sfard talks about learning as acquisition or learning as participation, and that each one of those metaphors for what we mean when we talk about learning has implications for a lot of things, implications for what the student does, for what the teacher does, for what our concept of knowledge is, what the nature of what it means to know is. And to really oversimplify, if you think about learning as acquisition, it can be thought of as sort of an individual activity where learning is sort of a property of the mind that is, in essence, something that you own. It's something that you can get kind of through individual effort. Whereas learning as participation is thought of as learning that is not necessarily just knowledge in the mind or sort of inert knowledge, but knowledge in action, knowledge in the service of some activity that's valued by a group, a community, and that knowledge is really just increasingly effective performance within that community, increasingly effective ability to be sort of an effective member of the community. And, you know, as I mentioned, those different conceptions of what it means to learn have implications for the goal of the learning, what learning is, what the student does, what the teacher does, the nature of knowing. And I think one of the most common critiques of learning as a form of acquisition is that the kinds of activities that surround learning or are meant to make learning happen tend to result in inert knowledge, the kinds of knowledge that students are able to demonstrate in a form of performance through assessment on a test, for example, but then rapidly forget and don't apply beyond the immediate learning context. Whereas a participation metaphor of learning is meant to help activate knowledge and make it more of in the service of doing something that's valued by a community, whether it's a small community, the classroom community, or a more authentic community beyond the classroom space. So there are different pedagogies that are associated with these different forms of different metaphors for teaching and learning. And if we think about learning as a form of increasingly effective participation, cooperative, collaborative, and active or interactive pedagogies are more complementary as opposed to pedagogies that might be more competitive or individualistic. And that takes us to this community of inquiry model, which is meant to be a framework for describing, explaining, predicting, and improving teaching and learning in online environments. And if folks are familiar with the community of inquiry model, which many people are, it's probably the most widely cited theory for online teaching and learning that we have. You'll know that it's composed of, or is meant to represent the different instructional, social, and cognitive dynamics that occur in classrooms, and to sort of represent how those dynamics might occur in the absence of face-to-face interaction. So to expand a little bit more on that, these are some of the early kinds of ways of describing what the social and epistemic dynamics are with regard to the model. So the social presence really kind of describes the ability of participants to project themselves as real people, not as just entities in a computer network, but to really have themselves be understood and to be seen and heard and felt as real people. And teaching presence describes, you know, again, the design and facilitation and direction of these processes, whether they be cognitive processes, instructional processes, social processes, for achieving outcomes that are worthy of a higher educational system. So the kind of higher order thinking, critical thinking that can stand in for sort of generic college level learning outcomes. And cognitive presence describes the extent to which learners are able to, you know, interact, to develop and construct and confirm meaning through these kinds of pedagogies that are more participatory, more collaborative, more cooperative, in the goal of achieving higher order thinking. So that in a big picture describes the kinds of outcomes that the model and the processes that are meant to achieve the outcomes that the model reflects. I mean, another way to think about the community of inquiry model for me is to talk about how the forms of presence are measured through research. So a lot of folks have done research on the community of inquiry model, and the typical ways to look at the research is through survey items or through quantitative content analysis. So with survey items, you ask, dozens, hundreds, or in our case, we asked thousands and now probably tens of thousands of online learners a lot of questions about their experiences in the online environment, their experiences with teaching presence, social presence, and cognitive presence, and trying to figure out, what does this tell us about the community of inquiry framework? What does it tell us about the dynamics of online teaching and learning? How do we help students to achieve the kinds of higher order thinking that are described by the model? Other researchers, and including us, and my colleagues at the University of Albany have used quantitative content analysis and look at student interactions and artifacts in the course. One of the things that we did was to look at entire courses, 2 complete courses, and to code every instance of student contribution to the course, whether they're in this typical place where people look, which is in threaded discussions, or whether they were in assignments or areas outside of the threaded discussions, like even in course emails, trying to identify instances of teaching social and cognitive presence and trying to identify where does this stuff typically happen. Well, what we found with that research was that a lot of the teaching presence that typically gets identified to be inside of threaded discussions actually occurs outside in different areas of the course. And I think it was work that hadn't been done before that.
Peter, I had a quick question on that. Were you able to look at all or at social media, say Twitter or Facebook or anything like that?
We were actually just looking at the artifacts that occurred within the learning management system. So, and in these 2 complete courses, there were not instances, there weren't other applications like Twitter being used in those courses, so it wasn't really available to look at. But yeah, I think that would be a great research project for those kinds of courses that, go outside of the LMS to be looking for what are the dynamics and, what's happening and where is it happening. So yeah. Another way of looking at, this gives you an example of the cognitive presence items that are typically looked at in survey research. There's actually a semi-official community of inquiry survey that was developed by Randy Garrison, Karen Swan, Ben Arbaugh, me, and a few other folks that tried to standardize on a set of questions that would reflect the forms of presence that are described in the model, but without overwhelming people. And we went through a number of iterations to get to the current survey. We actually do a different survey now, one that uses a new construct that we call learning presence, which talks more about self-regulation that we didn't think was reflected in the model. It's created quite a bit of controversy. Randy Garrison was not particularly happy about adding a 4th form of presence to the model, but so be it. This is quantitative content analysis. These are, again, there's a sort of a standard quantitative content analysis set of kind of scoring sheets that have been used to try to identify instances of teaching social and cognitive presence. This one is examples of social presence, which include active responses, interactive responses, and cohesive responses, and trying to identify where those occur. So there's different ways of defining and measuring elements within the community of inquiry framework that come up with different results. So getting specifically to, what does it mean to establish cognitive presence? The early work on describing cognitive presence used, different kind of theoretical and conceptual framing. And Randy Garrison talked a lot about a cyclical process in which there were different phases, a triggering event, an exploratory phase, an integration phase, and a resolution phase, which are characterized by different kinds of discourse that happen within those phases, ideally. So, getting into a little bit more about the practical inquiry model that underlies cognitive presence within these triggering events, exploration, integration, and resolution, there's different kinds of discourse that tend to characterize these if you're doing it well. And those different kinds of discourse tend to represent increasingly, I think, higher forms of learning or knowledge creation. So in the early phase, there's a recognition or the insertion of a problem, and to try to evoke a sense of curiosity or puzzlement on the parts of learners. And then in the exploratory phase, there's sort of an inquisitive kind of discourse where there's a lot of different ideas being suggested, so set of divergent ideas and with a lot of testing and exploration, sharing information, brainstorming. And then as the knowledge creation process is facilitated, ideally again, there may be, the hope is to come to some sort of convergence within messages and connecting ideas and synthesizing and creating solutions until we get to this final stage of resolution where there's vicarious application to the real world, testing solutions, defending solutions. A lot of the research on the COI model that has been focused on looking at threaded discussions has come up short in getting to instances of integration resolution. There tends to be a lot more exploration in threaded discussions than these higher forms of integration resolution. So these are the indicators, specifically of cognitive presence. So the idea that you're trying to evoke curiosity, increase interest, get students to feel motivated to explore content, to brainstorm, to appreciate different perspectives, to combine information, to generate solutions. These sort of map onto Bloom's taxonomy of learning in a sense. If you look at the higher stages in the cyclical cognitive presence phases, you'll see that resolution, integration, and resolution kind of map onto the kind of evaluating and analyzing and applying levels within Bloom's taxonomy of learning. So the one issue is that a lot of the research in this area has not looked beyond threaded discussion to try to identify these higher order thinking skills, the higher order thinking that we're trying to get students to experience in college level courses. And I think that the opportunity for research in this area is to look beyond threaded discussions, to be looking at the kinds of wraparound activities, the kinds of essays or papers where integration and resolution is meant to be achieved. But it's a lot of work doing the kind of coding and looking for examples of this theoretical framework within student artifacts. But if we can identify what are the precursors or what are the necessary conditions to consistently develop students or consistently sort of result in the higher order kind of thinking that we're trying to get at in online learning environments, there's an opportunity to make a contribution to the whole online teaching and learning enterprise. So some of the research we've done has really been aimed at trying to understand students' reports of their experiences. So getting back to that cognitive presence construct, we've asked thousands. In one single survey, we had 5,000 student respondents to questions about their cognitive presence and the forms of social and teaching presence they experienced. And this little sort of model that teaching presence plus social presence results in cognitive presence is meant to summarize this sort of larger structural equation model that we did. We're trying to predict variance in this outcome variable, the big picture of cognitive presence, by measuring variance within the teaching and social presence that students report. So if we ask thousands and thousands of students about the instructional design and organization, the facilitation of productive discourse, and the provision of direct instruction reflected in the teaching presence factor, does it predict students' reports of feeling affectively, interactively, and cohesively connected to each other in the service of provoking curiosity, provoking exploration, provoking integration, and provoking resolution that's reflected in the cognitive presence construct? So again, we looked at a lot of this with many, many different students, and we're able to kind of, in a big picture way, predict a lot of the variance that students reported in cognitive presence. So when students are reporting high levels of cognitive presence, that they are getting to those higher order thinking skills, they are getting to the higher order sorts of outcomes that we're trying to develop through college level education. Though about 70% of the variance in whether students are getting there or not can be predicted or modeled based on whether they're experiencing good teaching presence and whether they're experiencing good social presence. And the social presence indicators are very interesting because they are contingent upon the teaching presence indicators. So to try to understand exactly what item level responses, what particular kinds of questions could predict whether students are getting to higher levels of cognitive presence, we did something called a chi-square automatic interaction detection. And that's called a Shea analysis. So if we looked at the mean of cognitive presence, it says cognitive presence reversed there. But if you just think about, we had a bunch of questions, basically from strongly agree to strongly disagree, and we had them reversed in different ways to try to not let students just create item sets where they all go through click, 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 and strongly agree, strongly agree, strongly agree, strongly agree. Anyway, we measured when they were strongly agreeing, and we also correlated those with the different kind of pools. So when were there significant differences between levels of agreement? Did they get to these higher levels of agreement on the cognitive presence factor? And what we found was when students reported that they felt comfortable participating in course discussions, which is a social presence item, their mean scores for cognitive presence were significantly different. So when students were reporting that they were not comfortable participating in course discussions, their cognitive presence scores could be predicted to be much lower, around 3.5, rather than when they did report comfort in participating in course discussions, where the means were closer to 4.5. So we know that the social presence indicator, this social presence item, predicts a lot of the variance in the cognitive presence factor. So if the goal of higher education is to get people to be curious, to explore, to integrate, and then to come to a sense of consensus and application beyond the classroom, their ability to apply ideas beyond the classroom, their comfort in being able to participate in online discourse through things like threaded discussion is essential to doing that. If we go down another level in this chi-square automatic interaction detection tree, this shade tree, you find that the instructor's behaviors are also highly predictive of student outcomes as it relates to getting to those higher forms of learning, to getting to those more substantial higher order thinking skills and critical thinking skills. When the instructor helps to focus discussion on relevant issues in ways that help students to learn, all of their responses on cognitive presence tend to be higher. So the instructor role is crucial to getting students to be able to get to those higher level thinking skills and that higher order thinking that we're trying to get to. Another social presence item predicts the highest levels, that we found in the cognitive presence factor. So when students feel like they get to know other course participants, and that gives them a sense of belonging in the course, when they report that, the highest pool of students is found as it relates to cognitive presence. So the highest mean scores for cognitive presence are contingent upon students reporting that they're able to project themselves as real people in the online environment. So the social presence construct does predict a lot of the variance in cognitive presence outcomes. Some other kinds of analysis we did something called cluster analysis, and we looked at students in both blended or hybrid courses and students in fully online courses. And you can see this sort of complex interaction between teaching presence, social presence, and cognitive presence. It's not actually that complex, but when you see that social presence is low, it predicts lower forms of teaching presence and cognitive presence. When it's medium, it predicts higher forms, and when it's at the highest level, it predicts the highest forms of cognitive presence. So social presence is a very important component in helping students to interact in productive ways. So in order to get to higher levels of cognitive presence, and with the realization or the research-based outcome that it's contingent upon establishing teaching presence, it's important to understand what teaching presence is. So this kind of just explains at a real base level what the concept is, the idea that there's a role for everyone within the online setting to be engaged in teaching presence. I actually kind of diverge on this, and I think that there are distinct roles for faculty and distinct roles for students to contribute. I happen to think the instructional design and organization component of teaching presence is primarily an instructor role, where the instructor sets the curriculum, designs methods, establishes time parameters, utilizes the medium effectively, and establishes an etiquette early on in the course. It's kind of hard to get students to do a lot of these things. They can be negotiated, and establishing time parameters, for example, can be negotiated, and deciding or understanding more or less what students are more interested in learning can be negotiated. But I think primarily this is an instructor's role or the faculty role. When it comes to the other, some of the other elements of teaching presence, like facilitating discourse and identifying areas of agreement and disagreement, reaching consensus, encouraging, acknowledging, and reinforcing student contributions, these sorts of things, I think the role can certainly be shared more between the instructor and students. But again, some of the research that we did in trying to correlate teaching presence with student satisfaction and students' reports of learning, we asked two sets of survey questions, one when students were doing these sorts of things, and one in which teachers are doing these sorts of things. And the correlation between higher levels of reported learning and higher levels of student satisfaction were significantly greater when the students reported that the instructor was doing these kinds of things. The same goes for providing direct instruction. These roles, I think, can be shared between teachers and students, between the faculty and between the students. But again, students tend to report much higher levels of satisfaction and learning when they feel that the instructor is taking on these roles or is central to doing these kinds of things. So again, a kind of research-based outcome for asking thousands and thousands of students these kinds of questions. So these are the things that help to lead to higher levels of cognitive presence. When the online instructor is communicating course goals and providing clear instructions and clarifying thinking and keeping students on task, helping them explore new ideas, focusing discussions, helping to establish a sense of community, and in some cases providing explanations or demonstrations, giving feedback and asking for feedback on how the course can be improved. This tends to lead to students feeling a sense of belonging and getting a distinct impression, feeling that online is a good way to engage in interaction, to identify with the thoughts and feelings of other students, to feel comfortable in conversing, participating, interacting, and disagreeing. and that online discussions help them develop an ability to collaborate or feel that their points of view are acknowledged. So that these two elements, the instructor role and the social presence role that comes out of that instructor role, result in these cognitive presence indicators. Getting students to go through this cycle of exploration, integration, and ultimately resolution. So again, the idea is that there's a strong role for the instructor to create both the instructional and social dynamics that result in the sort of cognitive outcomes that we're trying to get to. So I provided some sort of guidance within the framework itself as to what we can do, but there are other folks who have actually looked through cognitive presence and identified the kinds of things that can happen in both threaded discussions and other areas of the course that can be helpful in facilitating cognitive presence. And I borrowed this one from the URL at the bottom here. And I think a lot of this stuff makes a lot of sense, giving students a choice of questions and complex questions, assigning different kinds of contributions, assigning students to be discussion leaders and setting consistent due dates and expectations, and setting a threshold amount of participation is likely to result in higher levels of engagement with the kinds of online discussions that can lead to cognitive presence. Having students ask questions at the end of their posts, assigning partners, having the faculty member model the contributions as a co-learner, using rubrics to outline expectations, providing feedback and comments in the grade book. These are kinds of feedback that students tend to expect and want to see, and are highly correlated with cognitive presence. And kind of, especially I would imagine in MOOCs, limiting the volume of posts, but also in standard online learning, assigning a subset of students to post discussion starters, or creating small groups, modeling the scope of posts so things don't get so big that nobody wants to read them, and especially in larger format courses, kind of even reducing the number of required comments so that they become more manageable. I think a lot of that can be done in small group areas, and students tend to appreciate making the discursive processes more manageable. These are some tips to ensure learning points are actually made, that sort of in the direct instruction category, actively contributing, asking questions, clarifying points, adding commentary. And this can be done by both faculty and students, posting summary comments to sort of get people to understand the big picture of what happened in a discussion, and using student contributions to jump off to underscore key ideas, especially to identify where students well understood or maybe even didn't understand things very well.
There's a question on Twitter, Peter, from Rick Bartlett, and he wanted to know about if you could talk about any practical applications, specific tools such as VoiceThread and how those might be used.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Rick. I think we're actually doing research on VoiceThread right now. We just gathered data from students in a pilot study. And I think you're right, that example specifically, I think that there's a lot of rich sorts of discourse that are, encouraged or facilitated through the use of richer media. We're going to be doing an analysis of this, but we have, a lot of semesters worth of student contributions and specific forums, where we know and can kind of predict what kinds of student discourse is being generated in text-based threaded discussions. And now we're looking at the kinds of discourse that are being generated when students are posting, audio files or video files. And right off the bat, I think one of the things we're just discovering is that the use of tools like VoiceThread, where students have an opportunity for either posting directly to a threaded discussion in audio or video format, it seems to create a performance sort of environment where the students, in addition to preparing comments that they might do in text, also seem to be even more interested in creating a high level of performance. I think that can be for good and for bad, because the kinds of postings that we were looking at were 5, 7, 10 minutes long. We were not expecting that because we were not requiring it or requesting it, but there seems to be a performance sort of mode that is encouraged by participating with richer media. I think there are probably other applications that can help people get to higher levels of cognitive presence. And you can think of things like the annotation feature in VoiceThread, or annotation features and other platforms that allow for students to comment on an artifact like a reading or even a presentation, and to ask questions, to puzzle about things, to contribute comments about what is particularly resonant with them, or what is confusing to them on a reading or a presentation, and to get answers from other students with that rich media. So I think there are probably other practical applications beyond threaded discussions when we're trying to encourage higher levels of cognitive presence and to facilitate the kinds of teaching presence that help us get there vis-a-vis social presence. And I think that richer media tend to result in higher recognition as it relates to social presence. So it's a great question. Other questions? Patrice?
I had a question. You mentioned MOOCs a little bit, and I was just wondering, that is definitely a problem, trying to help students kind of navigate, a social identity among thousands and thousands of posts, and how does an instructor have teaching presence among that? And I was just wondering if you were looking at that at all, or if you had any insights into any work that's being done in that area.
I think the conceptual framing that I would bring to it has to do with this equivalence model. And I think that Terry Anderson, who wrote a lot about teaching presence, put out this model that said that there are forms of presence that, if they're high or low, are likely to result in worse outcomes. So I think as it relates to MOOCs, given the sheer volume of participants, it's going to be difficult to facilitate discourse the way you can in smaller settings, or to provide direct instruction the way you might in smaller online settings, and that the opportunity to impact teaching presence in these larger format courses has more to do with instructional design and organization, and providing a really excellent design for courses, and then really leveraging the students and student knowledge and the opportunities for sharing student knowledge in smaller forums. So I think there needs to be probably more experimentation with small group discussions within large format settings, and to be able to surface students of varying ability levels earlier on, and students of varying motivational levels earlier on, so that the groups can be generated such that you have students with both, of mixed ability groupings, and that those mixed ability groupings that could come from, early kinds of assessment of student understanding of the content, or students' motivational levels to understand the content, create mixed ability and motivational groupings that would, I think, be beneficial. But I think because of the large numbers that, the traditional methods that we've applied, where the instructor can take a very active role, will be very, very difficult to apply in the current forms of MOOCs. Has that been your experience, Patrice?
Yes. We have tried, using some of this, smaller groups and using some different annotation tools, to try and help students navigate it a little bit better. But in general, yeah, one of the things that we've been successful with, which was the next question I was going to ask you, we've used tools such as this and Shindig to have live sessions where the faculty can actually interact one-on-one with the students who are on the MOOC. And so it actually gives them a chance to, say, come up on stage and ask a question and, interact in a live format with their peers and with the instructors. And so we've found that's made a huge difference. And I just wondered if you had done, any research, using, live synchronous sessions.
No, I haven't. And I'm aware of, broad scale meta-analytic research that looks, that's looked historically at differences between synchronous and asynchronous forms of online instruction. And I think the environment's evolving so fast that some of the older research is not very useful. Some of the older research was finding that synchronous forms of online teaching and learning were in some ways less effective than asynchronous forms of instruction. But I think that's limited to these sorts of formal credit-bearing courses that have typically had smaller cohorts of students in them, and that in newer environments with large, that are large-scale online formats, that we do need new research to understand what are the, instructional and sort of epistemic inputs that are going to result in students feeling like they're getting the maximum benefit out of these environments. And I think you're right. I think that the anonymity and the sort of overwhelming sensation you get when you're in a forum with hundreds or thousands of students really turns people off, and that in whatever way we can do to make these environments in some ways more intimate, even if they are for short durations, that there's going to be a higher level of students feeling like, okay, I'm connecting with others, I'm able to establish that sense that I have, that that people know me, that I'm a real person in this, not just another number or name or screen, name, and that my needs are being heard and that my goals can be met. But I think it's the very large scale anonymity that we really have to be trying to battle against. So yeah, that's problematic. We need more research in that. Other questions or?
Well, one quick question was whether you will be sharing the presentation.
Sure. Yeah, I can make the presentation available for sure.
Okay.
I think that there's more to be explored here. These tips were from this website. I think if folks want to follow that link, we'll find a lot more on general recommendations for helping to establish cognitive presence, and some of these kind of cross over with other recommendations. But that's kind of everything I had to share on this topic today.
And you mentioned, the research that you're doing. If people wanted to participate in that research or consult with you, are there any opportunities for some of our learners to participate?
Sure, folks can send me questions about the research. I'd be glad to answer. We're actually doing research on the colleges and the Open SUNY consortium, and trying to better understand what are the kinds of predictors of student success in these, this large scale higher education online enterprise, and collecting data from all the colleges that are participating in Open SUNY, and trying to get a better sense of how that program is succeeding and where there may be opportunities for making it even better. So yeah, there's opportunities for conversation for sure.
Okay. I don't see any other questions on Twitter, but I'll let people know that they can contact you if they have any other questions. And
Okay.
thanks a lot for joining us today. We appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Patrice. My
Thank you.
pleasure. All right. Bye-bye.